Good morning. Um, Now we are going to switch to another aspect. We are going to talk about vulnerability assessment and decision support systems for climate risk management. I will share in this presentation with you some experiences, practical experiences that we have in South America. This is presented by CIFEN. It's the International Research Center on El Niño. We are located in Guayaquil, Ecuador. And I have to start with a very simple and frequent question. That this family interested about the flooding was caused by climate change or climate variability? And at the end, the answer is no. This family needed to avoid the flooding or at least be prevented to react. This is not only a climate-related matter. We need to have public policies translated in effective actions. For that, decisions in the ground should be made on the basis of good and opportune information about climate, about vulnerability, and expected impacts. At this moment, in the climate community, a lot of efforts are ongoing in terms of monitoring, forecast, prediction, and research. For instance, this is the images of the last El Nino 82, 83, and 97, 98. Now we are not talking so much about El Nino. Last year we have very bad forecasts and predictions of El Nino intensity. So there is still open questions about El Nino. But there are important numbers. This is very familiar with you. This is UNSCR statistics. And while the number of storms fluctuates around the average, the number of floods increases. And as we probably know, the answer of this pattern is mostly explained by the vulnerability, not just the climate. So we, in practical terms, and for implementation of this kind of assessment, we put in practice some principles. To understand and estimate the near climate change, there is the trend to talk about climate change and work with scenarios 50 years ahead, 70 years ahead. But in practical terms, we try to work in the near climate change scale, horizon 10 and 15 years, because it's a time frame consistent with planning and the nearest to the political cycles and decision maker needs. We think that with this horizon, we are more probably engaging to the politicians and the decision makers. To prioritize the analysis of indexes derived from observed climate data, rather than climate scenarios and projections, more focus on climate variability is needed. In practical terms, and this is the third one, present climate risk management is the best way to implement adaptation. Now we're talking a lot about adaptation when we have the climate risk management which is not unsolved. So there is a clear need to harmonize the agenda of climate change and risk management. And for that, we need to understand first and estimate the present vulnerability and try to understand how could be the vulnerability change pattern in the future at local scale especially. Adaptation to climate change is a bottom-up social construction that should be implemented by local communities. Then, this is a very typical image about the components of risk. And we have to remember that the vulnerability is internal component of the risk. Then the elements are the only that can be managed. That's the concept. Vulnerability has the elements that we can manage. So if we need to risk management, to manage the risk, we have to risk the elements of the vulnerability. So the vulnerability should be studied and understood. For example, in terms of agriculture sector, when we talk agriculture sector, normally we establish the most simple relation, climate and agriculture. But in the reality, in the ground, we have more elements there. Lack of climate information, one, public policies, increase of plagues and diseases, ecosystems basing status, excess of fertilizers, markets, limited research on genetics, water use conflicts, limited technology transference, limited or inexistent risk transference, land degradation. These are real elements that are there and are contributing with the general and the overall vulnerability. So we will have to try to consider them in the vulnerability assessment. Why to assess vulnerability? To identify the social, economical, and environmental elements that make a community vulnerable. To better understand the dynamics of these elements over the territory in terms of spatial distribution and along the time, temporal changes. Having a special approach of the vulnerability helps to risk managers to prioritize actions in the ground, because in risk management, always prioritize is a key issue. Having a temporal approach to the vulnerability helps to prospective risk management to intervene over the critical elements and assess the impact of these actions as indicators to see if we are working well and if the results are good. To work on risk management based on a comprehensive vulnerability assessment put to risk managers in the way to solve the structural problems, not just responding to the emergencies. So, some considerations. The assessment of the social, economical, and environmental components of climate vulnerability should consider the following criteria: to be based on evidences of the historical relationships, climate populations, climate ecosystems, climate livelihoods, identify the non-climate factors which could influence in the previous relationships, to include the non-climate factors as components of the vulnerability, and to weight these factors based on the experience of local stakeholders and communities, and historical information, of course. So here is, I will pass this quickly, but all the information will be in some brochures that I will add there. This is the implementation of an information system of sectoral vulnerability for climate variability and change in Guayas, province Ecuador. This was supported by the province government, and we work in a model for the vulnerability, considering social, environmental, and economical elements. This is the equation that we use with variables that can approach and be proxies of this variable. The analysis unit we use two analysis units, social and economical component at parish level, and for the environmental component, micro basins. And at the end, this is just to give an idea, the methodology for different components, the social, the economical, and the environmental things, and how we combine all these elements in a common scale to represent it in a color scale that at the end produce this kind of map, which are intuitive and more easy to understand for decision makers. And finally, this was posted in an online visualization system, web-based, which is easily accessible. If you can visit this link, you can access to the maps, download the maps, the methodology, etc. And in this case, we have replicated this methodology, this approach for different ecosystems, different regions, urban areas, national scale, for example, in Ecuador for agriculture sector. These kind of maps are used by the authorities at national level, and for complex and very big cities as Quito, the capital. And these are the resources that are available in the website of CFEN. Final remarks: vulnerability can assess including many variables. However, it's better to limit the analysis to few, but meaningful and verifiable ones. The selection of variables should be supported by the community and local stakeholders' perception of climate impacts relationships. Vulnerability assessment should not become only a GIS application. The feedback of the community must be taken into account for validation. The climate risk management and adaptation must include climate-related factors and other independent of climate to be realistic and effective. CRM and environmental management are instruments that contribute with integrated territorial security and communities' resilience. And finally, to understand the vulnerability and estimate its probable evolution supports more effectively and efficiently to decision making. Thank you very much.